We welcome Dr. David Sauer to Rochester. He said he enjoyed his flight up here, but it was a little unnerving on the day of a plane crash and listening to live reports of that the whole way. But when we were talking, we agreed that it's probably a low-risk day, actually, statistically. I fly out tomorrow. I think I've got more to worry about, but we'll see. He is the Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the Center for Obesity Research and Education at the College of Public Health at Temple. You recently left Penn to take this position at Temple, and he was in the midst of this transition when we knocked on his phone to see if he might come here, and he graciously agreed in the midst of everything that must go on with a transition like that to come on up here. The only provision he had was, please don't drag me up there in the middle of the winter. So I'm glad it's a sunny day today. He's also the professor of social and behavioral sciences at Temple, editor-in-chief of a new journal, Obesity Science and Practice, the associate editor for both health psychology and obesity surgery, serves on a number of editorial boards of several other journals, and he was named to the editorial board of the American Psychologist in 2016. Much of his work is focused on the psychosocial and behavioral aspects of extreme obesity, and he's going to weave together today information about obesity, extreme obesity, and these psychosocial aspects with our department to get thinking about this. But there are members of other departments here and that will be at the consultation to think together about this project that we might embark on. He's leading a study funded by the National Institute of Health investigating the relationship between psychosocial function and outcomes of bariatric surgery. Has a wealth of experience in treating obesity with lifestyle modification interventions and pharmacotherapy, and has published approximately 200 papers and books based on his research. He's a gifted teacher and presenter. He was recommended to us by folks who had seen him do that live in other settings, and so I'm pleased that we were able to get him to come on up here to Rochester, and we'd like to welcome you and come on up and take the stage.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Rory. Let's talk a little bit about obesity treatment, and I'm thrilled that I've received 75 minutes for this, because the reality is I probably could go on for 3 hours, and in fact when I teach obesity to graduate students and undergrads, I typically spend about 3 to 4 hours presenting on all the facets. But we're going to do a little bit of a tour de force today. So we're going to spend a little bit of time early on talking about the obesity problem in the United States. What are some of the contributors that we have to the issue that we all deal with, and that I can now say with even more level of authority than I did a few years ago that it truly is a major public health crisis in the United States. And then we're going to talk about the 3 main treatment modalities. So lifestyle interventions, lifestyle modification, talk a little bit about pharmacotherapy, and then we're going to talk more specifically about an area where I do a lot of my work, which is bariatric surgery. And then we're going to wrap things up by talking a little bit about how health systems like yours can think about implementing comprehensive weight management programs. I'm going to share with all of you some of the challenges that we dealt with at the University of Pennsylvania in putting one of these together, and then use that as the springboard into the consultation we're going to have after this presentation. So here are my disclosures. My relationships with these companies have no bearing on the materials that I'm going to present to you today. This slide is probably familiar to all of you in one form or another, and it really illustrates the scope of the obesity problem in the United States. And the most recent statistics now say that 70%, actually this slide needs to be updated, it's now 71% of Americans, and we're now above this line, who are either obese, meaning have a body mass index of 30 or greater, or who are overweight, represented in the red here. And with my students, we will actually spend a lot of time talking about what could it be that happened here in the late 1970s and early 1980s that caused this dramatic uptick and then the subsequent leveling off. And Some of these things are kind of intuitive, and we read about them in the mass media all the time when we think about proliferation of fast food, reliance on electronic devices, and so forth. Some of them perhaps are less so. One of the more interesting ones that I like to spend some time thinking about with my students is something that we tend to think of as being pretty innocuous, if not good for children, which is a show called Sesame Street. So Sesame Street debuted in the late 1960s. And what it did, and if any of you think about developmental psychology, it is a brilliant application of developmental psychological principles in terms of how it repeats numbers and letters. It's a great teaching tool for kids. When I took developmental psych, my professor made us watch it. But think about what it did. It taught a generation of parents that it was okay to use the television as a babysitter. And back then, all you had was Sesame Street and Zoom and Electric Company on PBS, and we only had one network of PBS. But think about how children's programming, like so many other things, has proliferated and grown since that period of time. But the larger message is that a generation of parents was taught that it's socially acceptable to put our kids in front of the television set. And so maybe that's part of the issue of why our children are not as active as they used to be. Our obesity problem is not reserved for adults. We see a similar pattern of results if we look at what's happened with our children and adolescents. And the most discouraging thing about this is that the evidence is incredibly compelling that if you become obese as a child or adolescent, chances are you're going to stay obese as an adult and throughout your adult life. A very sobering statistic. So when we hear from pediatricians who will say things like, in my 25 or 30 years of practice, I never saw kids this big before. And I don't really understand clinically how they got this big. The ability of that child and that family to turn back and correct that child to a normal body weight over the course of time is very slim. And so this is obviously a wake-up call to all of us to think about how do we even begin to prevent the development of childhood and adolescent obesity. When I started working in this field about 20 years ago, we talked an awful lot about obesity and things like diabetes and hypertension. And since that time, we now know that obesity impacts just about every organ system of the body in one way or another. So sleep apnea, which was rarely talked about 20 years ago, is now one of the 6 major comorbidities that we really talk about with our bariatric patients. But we also start to talk about things like cancer, reproductive capability, skin conditions like psoriasis that have links to obesity and inflammation. So I often will think that when I think about a comprehensive medical center, chances are that all of the specialists in the center see diseases that are impacted by the course of obesity, and obviously mental health professionals are not immune to that. Yet, we still have a fair amount of debate about whether or not obesity is truly a disease. So for many of us who have worked in the field for a long time, when the AMA came out in 2014 and classified obesity as a disease, we applauded and we gave that a standing ovation. We said, this is great, because after years of trying to convince people that it's not in the DSM, we now have recognition that obesity is a medical condition. And hopefully we'll get insurance coverage for it, like the treatment of other medical conditions. And yet, you have David Katz, who's up at Yale, who's an authority on childhood obesity and obesity prevention, who says, not so fast. That maybe by classifying obesity as a disease, the misguided urge to pathologize this condition reflects society's failure to come to terms with the need for prevention. Valid point. I disagree. Because I think when we talk about treating adults with obesity, this part of recognizing it as a disease is critically important. But his point is well taken that we also need to think about what are we doing for the next generation of patients. There are people who are authorities around the country and around the world who actually say we should be focusing all of the NIH research scholars on obesity on prevention. But then there are some of us who say, but then what are we going to do? Just cut a generation of people loose? and just sacrifice them and say, we're just going to start from scratch. Can't really do that. So when we think about obesity, I like to think about it as being a multifactorial disease. That even though I'm trained as a psychologist, I take a very cognitive behavioral approach to conceptualizing the disease and treating it. Most people still assume that I'm going to focus a lot of my energy on what's the interplay of obesity and other forms of psychopathology. In reality, I'm probably more in this green quadrant, that I look a lot at what are the environmental contributions to the development of obesity and how can we change an individual's interactions with the environment to affect change. But please appreciate that everybody looks at this issue from a slightly different perspective. So I have colleagues at places like Penn and Temple who I've shared the podium or a panel presentation at a national meeting, and I'll give a 15-minute talk on environmental and behavioral aspects of obesity and never mention the word genetics. And they'll give a 15-minute talk on the genetic components to obesity and never mention the word environment. And so you've got well-respected authorities who look at this issue from very different perspectives. And as one of my end themes for you to take home with you today is the need for all of us looking forward to be a little less myopic and a little more broad in our thinking about how we consider obesity and how we treat it going forward. In its simplest terms, and perhaps its oversimplification, obesity really is an issue that we eat, we take in more calories than we burn through our physical activity. And that by putting this scale out of whack, that's why we see the weight gain that we've seen in individuals and cultures and societies over the last several decades. But many of us also believe, as do I, that there's a genetic susceptibility here. That we all know somebody who can eat whatever they want and they never gain a pound. And we hate them for it. And we also have other things that happen that defy logic to the other extreme. So I worked with a patient for a long period of time who every winter gained 15 pounds. Started between Thanksgiving and Christmas. He had it on until about April, and then it came off. And if we tracked his weight and looked at his weight chart, for those 4 months, he gained weight almost like a hibernating bear. And he was tracking his intake, his physical activity didn't change, his behaviors didn't change, but there was something going on physiologically in him that I wasn't seeing in my other patients. I've had other patients who have a kidney, they're stuck at a weight, they get a kidney stone, they go in the hospital for a couple of days, the kidney stone passes, they come out, they've lost 15 pounds, never gain it back. That whole set point theory, that they've almost reset their weight. And frankly, I can't necessarily explain why that's happened. So there is this black box element, whether it's genetics or physiology, that plays a role in this equation. Looking at the physical activity side of the street, the evidence of how inactive we are is actually becoming very, very sobering. So this is a study done several years ago that made it in the New England Journal of Medicine that shows the trajectory of children and their decrease in physical activity as they move through late childhood into early adolescence. And look at how for both Caucasian and African American girls, activity as they get closer to puberty declines, and for African American girls, pretty much goes away. So we're seeing the increase in caloric intake, but not higher levels of physical activity. And this is one of two slides. By the way, I did tweak my slides a little bit this morning before the talk, so there are going to be a couple slides that are a little bit different. But this is just one slide that shows not only how physically inactive our kids are, but how much they've replaced activity with media use and overuse. So for many of us when we were kids, this time of year, now that we've gotten into baseball season, we would get together with our friends after school and play wiffle ball in the backyard or figure out a way to play baseball on the street. I actually had a neighbor who spray painted bases on the street, and you made up goofy rules of, if the ball hits Mrs. Jones's house, that's a double. but if it breaks through a window, it's an automatic grand slam and everybody run. But the idea was we were outside playing, and when we played, we usually said, all right, well, I grew up outside of Chicago, so I'm going to be the Cubs. Good year to be a Cub fan. Other people would say, well, I'm going to be the Yankees, I'm going to be the Mets, so forth. But why should I imagine being a Major League Baseball player if I can go to my Xbox or PlayStation and be that Major League Baseball player? I played baseball throughout high school, and I always feel this twinge of sadness when I go by baseball fields this time of year and see that they're empty. Because I also think not only are kids losing out on baseball, they're losing out on physical activity. And instead, here are some of the things that we're doing. And so when we start looking at kids and televisions not only in their homes, but in their rooms, and these statistics even seem a little dated to me now, because I think about my own son who's 13, who will often sit on the couch while he's got a TV show on and watch something else at the same time on his pad. So he's like watching two different programs at once, and yet this is the norm for many of our families. We also know that obesity comes with what I like to call a significant psychosocial burden, that it affects all of these different areas of psychosocial functioning that we're going to touch upon throughout our talk today. A couple that I do want to hit on right now, though. This issue of cognitive impairment is very interesting. There are a growing number of studies in the bariatric surgery literature that suggest that when you become extremely obese, you begin to show subtle declines in your executive functioning. So if you did a WISC or a WACE or some other measure of intellectual functioning, you'll start to see declines on some of those tests. Now, when the first studies in this area came out, the state of Tennessee jumped all over this and said, okay, everyone who wants to have bariatric surgery in the state of Tennessee should have an IQ test, which fortunately people said was discriminatory and an over-interpretation of those early results, and they were able to squash it before it became a reality. But we're seeing more and more of a signal that your cognitive functioning is not as sharp as it could be. You're not losing 10 IQ points, but you're losing a couple points on this subscale and a couple points on that subscale. The good news, when you lose weight, those deficits return, particularly with bariatric surgery. But we have all these interesting speculations on, well, what's the mechanism? Is it sleep apnea? Is it inflammation? Is it depression? We really don't know. But it's an interesting set of findings that unfortunately was on the verge of being overinterpreted by the mass media. In terms of mood and obesity, we know that as BMI increases, depressive symptoms increase. We also know that individuals who are obese are often socially isolated and lack in social support. And we know, as we'll come back to towards the end, that particularly among people who undergo bariatric surgery, there's a concern about suicide. A fun little anecdote. Any of you bother to go see the movie Concussion this past winter about the pathologist in Pittsburgh who was on the early stages of finding the association of CTE in football players? He also wrote one of the seminal papers on suicide in bariatric patients. So he's the lead author on that paper, and every time I cite it, I kind of smile a little bit because he really was on the cutting edge of the CTE issue, even though the NFL went to great lengths to try to discredit him. We also know that disordered eating is an issue among persons with obesity, but please note that I'm using the phrase disordered eating, not eating disorders, because obesity has never been in the DSM. We know that binge eating disorder is, the night eating syndrome is in as a diagnosis under further consideration. And without question, disordered eating plays a role in the development of obesity. But the disease of obesity has never been classified as a psychiatric illness, which is something that a lot of physicians don't know. They assume that at one point in time it was, as do, I would argue, many people in the American culture, that they assume obesity is a psychiatric illness, that if people just figured out how to control that impulse, they wouldn't have the issues with food that they have. We also know that it significantly impacts quality of life. So a number of studies that have been done using both the SF-36, the gold standard measure of health-related quality of life, as well as some weight-specific instruments have shown that quality of life deteriorates. Much like depressive symptoms, it is associated with BMI. A lot of the work that I've done has looked more specifically at body image and sexual functioning, which I'm not going to have time to drill down into today. And my colleagues and I have also offered that for many individuals, it's the impairments in quality of life and body image that likely motivate treatment. So for example, commercial weight loss programs make the lion's share of their money in the first quarter of every calendar year. Why? New Year's resolutions and people getting ready for the beach in the summertime. So strategically, what do? They roll out their new programs in November and December. They lock in their new celebrity endorsers during that period of time because that's their business model of how they make money. Because as you start moving into the spring and summer, everyone's outside. Nobody wants to come in for weight loss treatment. When we do our studies, we don't recruit in July and August because everyone's away on vacation. And then we have to be mindful of recruiting around the winter holidays because nobody really wants to focus on their weight between Thanksgiving and Christmas. They want to enjoy their time with food. But patients don't come in, even bariatric patients don't come in and say, I really can't wait for my hemoglobin A1C to go down. What they say is, they do the fist bump coming off the scale when they've dropped 10 pounds and the number has changed. Or they've dropped a dress size. Or they can tighten their belts. Or they can fit in a booth at a diner. Those are the things that motivate them to lose weight. When I was doing psychovals prior to bariatric surgery, I would ask patients, what specific thing are you looking forward to the most after surgery? And the most common answer I got was taking my kids to Disney World. Because I tried to do it in the past and either I didn't fit on the rides or I was so fatigued I couldn't keep up with them or I was so uncomfortable in the hot Florida sun that I had to sit in the shade the whole time. But that would be the most specific response that I got. It wasn't, I can't wait to get off my hypertensive meds. So for all of these reasons, I would offer to you that being mindful of the psychosocial aspects of obesity are something that should be front and center on the mind of all weight loss treatment providers, regardless of their discipline and regardless of when you're seeing patients. Because it's oftentimes these psychosocial issues that can interfere with engagement and compliance in treatment in all of its different forms. So it's really important that we be mindful. Again, it's a nuanced point here because we're not trying to say these are psychiatric patients, but rather that we need to be mindful that there's a significant psychosocial component to patients with obesity who are presenting for treatment. So let's talk a little bit about approaches to treatment. This algorithm was published back in the year 2000. And the American Heart Association, along with the Obesity Society, updated it in 2013. I'm showing you the old version only because the new version's flow chart for treatment is so convoluted that no one can make sense of it. This is much more straightforward and I think user-friendly to give you a framework to think about treatment. And so we're going to organize the next chunk of our talk in what we call lifestyle modification, which includes diet, physical activity, and behavioral modification. And you can see that that's appropriate for people across the BMI spectrum, starting with when people have a BMI of 25 or greater. Pharmacotherapy is appropriate for individuals with a BMI of 27 to 30 in the presence of comorbidities or with a BMI greater than 30, although interestingly, I was just reviewing a paper on the plane ride up, a nationwide survey of physicians that says that only less than 10% of American physicians actually agree that it's appropriate to use a weight loss medication with somebody with a BMI under 30. And then bariatric surgery is most appropriate for individuals with a BMI of 35 or greater in the presence of a comorbidity, 40 or greater in the presence of no comorbidities, but that's actually relatively rare. It's rare to see somebody presenting for bariatric surgery who is just extremely obese and has no weight-related health problems. But we're going to spend a little bit of time going through all of these treatment approaches in some detail. Before we do, though, I want to give you a little bit of a theoretical sense of how my colleagues and I conceptualize and understand engagement in weight loss treatment. And so we use the health belief model, which really states that whether or not a person practices a particular behavior can be understood by knowing two factors. Whether the person perceives that that there's a threat to health, and whether the person believes that a health practice will be effective in reducing that threat. For those of you who work in the area of obesity already, you know we've already got two problems. One of which is we know that a lot of patients who struggle with obesity don't recognize that it's a problem. So when we know that this also becomes a health disparities issue. For example, if we just look at the comparison between African American women and women of European American heritage, women who are African American are more accepting of larger body types, and they report less body image dissatisfaction as their BMI increases. Whereas Caucasian women report greater body image dissatisfaction as their BMI goes up. One of the implications of this is that it may be more challenging and difficult to recognize the health problems associated with obesity if within your cultural group of individuals it is more socially acceptable to have and to seen as more attractive to be of a larger body type. And so when we start looking at who presents for treatment, even though we know that obesity and extreme obesity is more common among African Americans, 1 in 8 African American women have a BMI over 40 in the United States right now. Yet, when we think about presentation for bariatric surgery, it's less than 20% of patients nationwide. A true health disparity gap. And some of it is clearly insurance, some of it clearly is access to care. But there's also this sociocultural component as well. But we also have to consider this fact that many individuals might have lost faith in weight loss efforts and think it's not going to make a difference. So if you've tried Atkins and Sugar Busters and the Zone diet, and then you tried something that your neighbor recommended, and you feel like you've had no success in controlling your weight, you may be a little reluctant to think that anything will help you control your weight. So if you put these two elements together when we think about obesity, we are already behind the 8 ball, behind the curve. And in fact, that's one of the things that we've talked about, that many individuals who struggle with obesity, and this is a chapter I wrote with Bob Kushner, who's head of the weight management program at Northwestern, many people do not recognize the health threat associated with obesity. Think about some of the comments that I've made to you already about what am I looking forward to the most after bariatric surgery. It's not the hypertension, it's not the diabetes, it's dysmorphia. So we miss what those issues really can be. At the same time, people have a history of failed weight loss attempts and may be reluctant to try something new, and then others may really struggle to change their behavior in the face of the toxic food environment. So with the proliferation of food that we have in the United States, it's very easy to gain weight. For example, there was a study that came out about 7-8 years ago now. It was an epidemiological study. It came out like the Friday before Christmas break. So it kind of got lost in the news cycle. 9 out of 10 males on a college campus who are lean, have a normal BMI while they're in college, will die overweight or obese. 9 out of 10 males in their early 20s who are lean, have a normal BMI, their lives will end, and when they do, they will be overweight or obese. That sounds like an environmental problem to me, not a genetic one. So it's that toxic environment, as Kelly Brownell and others have said, which is probably playing a role. At the same time, we know that treatment providers oftentimes don't have a lot of faith in the currently available treatments, particularly pharmacotherapy and also bariatric surgery. So there's a paper that just came out in the new journal that I edit, Obesity Science and Practice. It actually got some media attention this week that we were thrilled about. that shows that patients who are eligible for pharmacotherapy for obesity, less than 1% in the United States is receiving it currently. And some of that, again, might be patients not believing it, medications too expensive, not covered by insurance, but we also know that some of it might be the treatment providers, after all the medications that have been pulled off the market, now may say, why would I want to do that? So again, how do we motivate patients? How do we get them to think about changing their behavior? Well, some of the approaches include things like educational and fear-based approaches. And when I do clinical work, and you probably gathered this a little bit through the first 20 or so minutes of my talk, I can be a colorful, charismatic speaker. And I'm not opposed to being a little bit of a hot dog with patients, and I'll even say to them, if I thought I could change your behavior by getting up on my desk, screaming at you and saying, lose weight or you are going to die, I would do it. But it's not going to work, because we know that fear-based approaches don't work. And I also then remind myself that probably there are other people in the person's lives who have tried that fear-based approach, and the patient hasn't listened to them, the kids, the spouse, the neighbor. Why are they going to listen to me just because I think I'm a quote-unquote expert? So we don't use fear-based approaches. We don't try to position ourselves as the authority, the expert, therefore do as I say. We can try to help patients change their attitudes and their healthy eating and activity behaviors. And this is something we really do try to focus on, that you're really not taking this on as a, quote, diet, but rather a lifestyle change. That you want to make small changes that you can sustain over time, and ideally for the rest of your life, as opposed to massive changes pulling the rubber band so far that it's inevitably going to snap back. And then also message framing, motivational interviewing strategies. How do we get patients to realize they want to change these behaviors because there's a bigger goal for them in doing so, like taking their grandkids to Disney World, like being around for a daughter's wedding, and so forth. So what are some of the tenets of lifestyle modification? First and foremost, caloric restriction, trying to get patients to reduce their energy intake by 500 to 1,000 calories a day. We try to increase physical activity up to a goal of 180 minutes a week, although I acknowledge I think that's a very, very ambitious goal for most Americans because we're just too darn busy. And then we also practice behavioral modification strategies, including self-monitoring of caloric intake and physical activity as well. In terms of the dietary plan, we encourage our patients to be structured, to eat on a regular schedule. We often will say 3 meals, 3 snacks a day. Think about eating something every 3 hours. And if you begin to fall into a pattern with that, you get used to the idea that food's always coming and you're never going to feel hungry. For individuals less than 250 pounds, we roughly recommend that they eat 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day, a little bit more if they're more than 250 pounds. We encourage them to reduce their portion sizes. And while we don't advocate anything rigorous like an Atkins approach, it's really more of a balanced deficit diet, so we're not eliminating food groups. But we encourage the increase of fruits and vegetables and the decrease of fats and sugars. In terms of physical activity, while programmed activity like jogging or aerobics or Pilates is great, we also spend a lot of time encouraging lifestyle activity. So walking as much as possible. I just, in my new dean's office, we just moved from one building to another, and I just got my first standing desk today. So we're going to see how this actually works out. Because while people seem to rave about these standing, it's one you can raise and lower. Some people say you do it for like 6 weeks and inevitably you lower it and you just find yourself sitting again. But it was kind of strange this morning to be in my office standing up doing my emails, because I realized when I'm in my office, I'm more or less doing emails. I'm usually out and about doing other things. And so by standing, I'm actually being a little more physically active than sitting all day. In terms of behavioral modification strategies, self-monitoring is the cornerstone of what we do. And while we used to talk about using paper and pencil food diaries, now we're talking about using smartphone apps, web-based portals as a way to track what you're eating, the calories you're consuming, in some cases fat and sugar. And then that gives us a platform to use some of these other behavioral modification approaches, so stimulus control, slowing the rate of eating, cognitive restructuring, and so forth. And I want to just put this slide up for just a second, and we're going to file this away under a clinical pearl that I'm going to leave with you. I think one of the greatest mistakes that we make as healthcare providers, regardless of our discipline, is that we give a recommendation at visit 1, and then we never mention it again at visit 2. So think about it. When we are patients ourselves, we go to a physician's office and we walk out with a receipt and a referral and a pamphlet and whatever, and inevitably we just end up with a pile that sits on our desk at home and we never look at it again. But in the blur of all that, we've probably gotten some feedback from our physician on some things we might want to do differently. Go see a dermatologist for a checkup, something like that. But the onus is on us, to a certain extent, to follow that guidance. But if we're going to encourage a patient to, why don't you try to have fewer desserts during the week as a way to decrease your weight? Why don't you try switching from soda to water? But when we see that patient a month later, if we don't mention it again, we're sending a larger message that that first recommendation wasn't that important. So when we put notes in our electronic medical records, we should always try to double back, and when we see the patient again, say, hey, remember the last time you were here, we talked about this. How did that go? Because it does send a message that we as providers are paying attention. And it also opens the door to congratulate our patients on success and to make sure that we're not criticizing them if they didn't follow through. This is one of many slides that I could show you on the benefits of record keeping. This is a study I did with my former colleague Tom Wadden at Penn several years ago that showed, and it's very consistent across modalities, the more record keeping that patients do, the more weight that they lose. Now this is just showing lifestyle modification alone versus lifestyle with medication. But the more that they record, the more that they track their own behavior, the more successful they are. Very intuitive for us who are mental health professionals. So how effective is a lifestyle-based intervention? Well, we've got a couple of seminal examples that we can look at. One here is a study started about 15 years ago called the Diabetes Prevention Program. And this study said, can a 7% reduction in weight combined with increases in physical activity reduce the risk of the development of type 2 diabetes for individuals with impaired glucose tolerance. So this was a large nationwide study, over 3,000 people, mean BMI of 34, and these people were randomly assigned to either a placebo, metformin, or an intensive lifestyle intervention like I've just described to you. Here are the weight outcomes after 4 years. They're not going to blow your socks off. As you'll see, the placebo group really exhibited no change in their weight. The metformin group lost about 2 kilograms. And the lifestyle modification group, with all these bells and whistles thrown at them, and this is a very, they call it comprehensive, I would call it intensive, maybe unrealistically so, intervention. You can see lost about 7 kilograms and then began to regain weight over time, as many people do. This is a very common J-shaped curve that we see in the weight loss literature. But here's, I think, the more compelling set of results. That remember, these people all had impaired glucose tolerance, so they're pre-diabetic. At the end of the 4 years, about 47% of those in the placebo group now had full-blown type 2 diabetes, compared to 25% in the metformin group versus 19% in the lifestyle modification group. So let's think about how you could translate that to clinical advice to a patient. That if you were able to lose 10 to 15 pounds over the next 4 years through diet and exercise, I can reduce your risk of becoming a type 2 diabetic by 58%. That's a take-home message that patients can hang their hats on. That is somebody who says, I'm pre-diabetic and I just watched my mom lose a limb to type 2 diabetes and I'm scared. That's a finding that you can give to a patient to hang a hat on. That if we help you achieve a modest weight loss and you keep it off, you're going to reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes in the next 4 years by almost 60%. But these interventions, both DPP and its subsequent partner study Look Ahead, were high-intensity, very specialized, high-cost interventions done in research clinics around the United States. And it begs the question, can we take the model of those interventions into physicians' offices, or do we need to use commercial programs or the internet to try to do this? And so one of the things, along with Tom Wadden and the rest of our group at Penn did several years ago, was we took that approach and said, what if instead of making people come to us at Penn in West Philadelphia, we go out to community-based primary care practices and we train their staffs to do the intervention. So they're on the front lines with people with obesity and diabetes and the metabolic syndrome. Can we teach people out there to do this? And so we randomly assigned 390 people to one of 3 different conditions. So usual care for obesity and their comorbidities, which we define as quarterly visits, brief lifestyle counseling, or what we called enhanced lifestyle counseling, where the counseling was augmented with either weight loss medications or the use of meal replacement products. So things like Nutrisystem, and we use both sibutramine, which is no longer available, and Orlistat, which is now over the counter as Ally. And what you see is that the enhanced condition lost significantly more weight than those who got brief lifestyle counseling and those who got usual care alone. So by not only providing some counseling in the practice, but by augmenting it with other interventions, we were able to get the largest possible weight loss. So the good news in terms of looking at lifestyle modification intervention is that studies suggest that in an intensive version of these things, people can lose 7 to 10% of their initial body weight within the first 6 to 12 months. These losses, while maybe not putting people on the cover of Glamour or Elle magazine, are associated with significant improvements in weight-related comorbidities. And for these reasons, this new set of guidelines from the American Heart Association and the Obesity Society now consider a 5% weight loss to be a clinically significant loss and an appropriate first goal for weight loss treatment. So even though you may have a patient who wants to lose 50 or 60 pounds, a good thing to do is to anchor them into this notion of by helping you lose 5% of your weight, which is only 10 pounds for somebody who weighs 200 pounds, I can improve your overall health. And that's our first goal here. But here's the bad news. Approximately 1/3 of patients will regain all of that weight within 1 year, and almost all of them will regain it within 5. So while lifestyle modification works in the short term, against the backdrop of that toxic food environment, we see people really struggle to keep their weight off. And that's where many people then begin to turn to pharmacotherapy and weight loss medications. And there are currently 5 different medications available throughout the United States. If I was here 2 years ago, it would have been 1. And that was Orlistat and its over-the-counter version, Ally. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details here, and that's really for a couple of reasons. One, the results more or less are all the same. Patients are losing about as much as they lose with lifestyle modification interventions. But 2, even with this new generation of medications coming online, the uptake among the general population is very, very low. Discouragingly low. So low that Takeda is getting out of the business. Novo Nordisk, which liraglutide was their diabetes medication, is remarketed as Saxenda for weight loss, is struggling because this injectable costs about $1,000 a month for patients. And we know that obesity differentially affects people from lower socioeconomic status groups. So the patients, we see the greatest amount of obesity among people who are least likely to have the funds to be able to pay for them, because insurances are not paying for these medications. So this has become an issue of we've built it, or the pharmaceutical companies have built it, and no one's coming. It's also part of what we talked about before in terms of, I think there's a level of suspicion among physicians, regardless of their discipline, about the safety and the efficacy of these medications in the long term, because many physicians tell us they've been burned by them in the past. So you can see all of the challenges and considerations that go into this. And that's probably one of the reasons we don't see the uptake of the medication that we would otherwise like to see. So let's talk about bariatric surgery. There are two major procedures performed in the United States at this time. Those are both the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, which is on the far right-hand side. This, for the last several decades, has been called the gold standard operation. Surgeons come in, they create a gastric pouch. You can see that staple line right there. So they create a gastric pouch there. They disconnect the small intestine here, reconnect it up here, such that the lower part of the stomach and the upper part of the small intestine are now bypassed. So food comes down the esophagus, into this pouch, and then directly into the small intestine. The newer kid on the block is the sleeve gastrectomy. The procedure is growing rapidly in popularity, both in the United States and throughout the world. Our programs in both my former program at Penn, my current program at Temple, in a matter of just a couple of years, we're doing almost 70% sleeves, 30% bypasses. It was exactly flipped 2 years ago. It's a very straightforward operation, so straightforward a psychologist can explain it. Surgeons go in and pretty much remove 85 to 90% of your stomach. So essentially creating this sleeve. So what remains is the esophagus to the sleeve of the stomach and into the small intestine. The weight losses are similar, as we'll see. Many surgeons believe this is an easier and safer operation. That's because of the lack of the anastomosis, or the two anastomoses, you don't have the complication rates that you had with the bypass procedure. How successful are they? Well, the most durable and impressive results we have, at least with the bypass, come from something called the Swedish Obese Subject Study, which has been ongoing in Sweden for the last 20 years. And I just want to draw your attention to the green line here at the bottom. These are the gastric bypass patients. As you'll see, within the first year after surgery, patients who have a gastric bypass lose about 30 to 35% of their initial body weight and then begin to regain their weight over time. Do not overinterpret what's going on here and begin to wonder why the weight's going down. One of the reasons is probably the deterioration of the sample size. So the sample size goes from 265, I suspect many of you can't see this, 265 down to 58 at year 10, down to 10 at year 15. So many of us believe that as the sample continues to mature and go further out, this line's going to flatten out and end up about up here. But I also think this is an important finding to share with people. This is a study that comes out of the state of Utah, and an epidemiologist and public health professional, Ted Adams, who does a great deal of work, who shows something very interesting. At 2 years after bariatric surgery, the modal group, or the modal weight loss, is a weight loss among Utah residents between 36 and 40% of their initial body weight. And then you notice you've got a normal distribution on both sides of it. So you've got some rock stars who have lost over half their body weight, and then you've got some people who have had a suboptimal outcome. At 6 years, the black line, look what's happened. The entire curve has taken 2 steps to the right. And this is probably the most compelling evidence that we have now that says that weight regain after bariatric surgery is normal and predictable to a certain extent. Because it seems like everyone's regaining 5 to 10% within that first decade. We'll talk about the reasons why in a few moments. In terms of mortality rates, this slide is a little bit dated. If anything, the statistics have become more encouraging, that the mortality rates are actually very, very low, particularly in high-volume programs in comprehensive medical centers that have been doing bariatric surgery for a long period of time. Surgeons will argue that it's safer than taking out your gallbladder. We also know that the improvements in comorbidities are incredibly impressive. So look at the percentages of people with either resolution or improvement in diabetes, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and sleep apnea. And again, this is a seminal review from over a decade ago, but the results still hold true today. What about psychosocial functioning? Similarly robust, encouraging results. And what's really neat about this, you see these improvements before patients reach their maximum weight loss. So most studies suggest that we see these improvements in depressive symptoms, anxiety, quality of life, body image at the 6-month mark as people are still losing weight. Now, whether that's part of the honeymoon effect of losing this massive amount of weight or those psychological benefits are truly realized early on, it's a little bit hard to say, but I think it's very encouraging nonetheless. However, we know that a subset of patients who undergo bariatric surgery, and I would estimate it to be in the neighborhood of 20 to 25%, can struggle with a whole range of issues during their postoperative course. And we're not going to go through all of these, but some of the things that we think about are patients who lose an excessive amount of weight and now have loose hanging skin, individuals who have issues within their marriage or their sexual behavior, and then these issues that we will spend a couple minutes on, the return of pre-existing psychopathology, the presence or specter of substance abuse problems, and then postoperative weight regain. There was a study that came out earlier this spring, which I didn't include here, that actually shows and confirms that we see a higher than expected rate of suicide among people who have undergone bariatric surgery. Why this is, we do not know. We know that in general, people who present for bariatric surgery have higher rates of psychopathology than the general population. So it could be that some of these patients are having a return of those pathological symptoms, which are contributing to their suicidality. We also know that many are socially isolated. So could it be a social isolation issue? We know that some marriages end after bariatric surgery. Could it be related to that? We don't really know, but we do know that in most programs you probably will have one every couple of years. And while we've tried to scratch the surface in our own programs and figure out, it can be really hard to tease it out. It's still a pretty infrequent event, but I think one that's particularly alarming and concerning to those of us who are mental health professionals. Another interesting issue that's getting an increasing amount of traction is the use and abuse of substances after bariatric surgery. This study comes out of the LABS Consortium, which is an ongoing consortium of bariatric programs throughout the United States, grant funded by the National Institutes of Health. And this study was led by Wendy King, who's at the University of Pittsburgh. This paper was the most downloaded paper from JAMA by far in the year that it came out. What's really interesting about the results is in about 2,000 bariatric patients, in the first postoperative year compared to baseline, the prevalence of alcohol use disorders did not vary. So it was 7.6% preoperatively and 7.3% postoperatively. But at the second postoperative year, it jumped up to 9.6%. And rumor has it, although they haven't published the paper yet, when we go out to 3 and 4 years, the number is going to continue to grow. What are some of the predictors? You can see them here. They look a little bit like guys who watch football in bars on Sunday afternoons. I'm being a little flippant, I know. But men younger age who smoke, who consume more than 2 alcohol drinks per week, engage in recreational drug use, a lower sense of belonging, and were had bypass as opposed to a band or a sleeve. And really people are beginning to drill down on this issue because it is of concern. We also know that the way the body processes and metabolizes alcohol after a bypass is dramatically different, with evidence suggesting that you can meet the legal limit of being drunk inside of 10 minutes of a single glass of wine in a laboratory setting. Inside of 10 minutes. Really staggering when you think about it. This is also an issue that got a lot of attention several years ago and then kind of went away and is now coming back a little bit. this notion that people can develop something called addiction transfer, where the belief being that they were addicted to food prior to surgery, and that's why they became extremely obese, and now after surgery they're addicted to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So they have all sorts of impulse control disorders. And while there's been no definitive study on this issue, and as many of you know, there is no such term in the DSM called addiction transfer, this has become both a very popular mass media topic and one that has now gotten the attention of the research community. We've heard and seen enough anecdotal reports to begin to think there's probably something there. And in fact, in the new study that we have, we're specifically looking not so much at alcohol or marijuana use or other drugs, but more generally changes in impulsivity. So could it be that for people who struggle with their weight and end up having bariatric surgery, it's not about mood disorders in isolation, it's not about eating in isolation, but maybe they have more general issues with impulsivity, which manifest themselves differently across people. I want to spend a few moments talking about weight regain after surgery and then talk more generally about implementing a weight loss program in a comprehensive medical center setting. This is an issue that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about the last few years, which is while bariatric surgery is the best tool that we have to treat obesity, for 20 to 30% of people, they don't do as well as we would expect. They either don't lose as much as we think or they regain very quickly. And why might that be? Well, it could be physiological adaptations. It could be that something with the gut hormones is adapting over time and that's why they're regaining weight. It could be this notion of preoperative psychopathology. We know that people who are binge eaters prior to surgery will often regain weight quickly after bariatric surgery. And then also could it be that these patients struggle to adhere to the post-operative diet? And in fact, this is something we found in a study several years ago, where we asked our patients 20 weeks after surgery, we said, how much are you adhering to the post-operative diet that was recommended to you by that dietitian? And we had some patients who we grouped as being high in dietary adherence who said, I'm following it to the letter. And then we had others who said essentially, what diet and what dietitian? I don't remember any of that. I just remember that my plumbing was rerouted. And in fact, as early as 40 weeks after surgery, we were seeing a statistically significant difference in the weight loss between the two groups, increasing to a 9% difference almost 2 years after surgery. And this is a busy slide, but I just want you to look for a moment at the row at the top, which shows their daily caloric intake. So prior to surgery, patients are eating about 2,400 calories a day, which is more than that 2,000 calories a day recommended by the USDA. Post-operative week 20, they're down to almost less than 1,200 calories a day, but look at how it begins to drift up over time. And while this may not seem clinically significant, even though it's statistically significant, appreciate that this is a standard error, not a standard deviation. The standard deviation is over 600, which means 2 years after surgery, we've already got people eating above 2,000 calories a day. So they're already back to eating a diet that's going to promote weight regain over time. And that really means that we need to think about strategies to help people be successful with bariatric surgery for the rest of their lives. Because when we think about adolescents who get it done, and the growing number of young adults who get it done, we want to position those patients for success for a lifetime. We don't want to be setting them up to have to come back to have it done again and again and again, because ultimately the surgeons will say, you run out of real estate in the GI tract to work with, and there's not much more they can do after 1 or 2 procedures. So what are some of the strategies? Well, maybe we go back to some of the basics of lifestyle modification counseling, which is something that hasn't really been used after bariatric surgery. And then I have a doctoral student of mine, Lauren Bradley, who's now junior faculty at Rush University in Chicago, who for her dissertation actually showed that acceptance and commitment therapy, a 10-week course of ACT, can help get patients who regain weight back on track, and actually found that they lost about 4% of their weight in those 10 weeks, just having re-engaged in ACT principles, which I think was a really encouraging finding. So let me end in my last 5 or 7 minutes kind of setting the stage for what some of us are going to do in greater detail, having to do with setting up a multidisciplinary weight loss program. And I'm going to share with you some of the experience that I had at the University of Pennsylvania over the last several years. And please don't read into the tea leaves that I left right before we were about to hit the ground running with this thing. I was very much on the ground level of setting up this program, but had this opportunity to go to Temple and move into a leadership position in the dean's office, which I really wanted to do, and that's why I actually ended up moving along. But one of the things I'm going to tell you that had to happen to make this happen is we needed leadership, senior leadership buy-in. At a place like Penn, because of our affiliation with the university and being the health system and medical school that we are, we have expertise in obesity in silos all across the university. And it can be very challenging to get those experts to come together and put aside their egos and work together on a clinical program that's truly going to help our patients. And that was really one of our bigger challenges. So there was clearly recognition that obesity was becoming a problem within our health system for a variety of specialists. And we also knew that our physicians were not well trained to do this. But the reality is that most major medical centers don't have well-defined obesity centers. And many of us believe that what we're likely going to see in the next 1 to 2 decades is the development of obesity centers that are going to look an awful lot like comprehensive cancer centers do today. Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take the development of a multidisciplinary team where the people from all the relevant departments come together in a physical space to see patients collectively rather than sending them out throughout our health system, which is the problem that we had at Penn. So we had our stunted weight management program, which was really our lifestyle modification program. We did a little bit of pharmacotherapy. It was housed in the Department of Psychiatry, named after Ricky Stunkard, you know, previously the world's leading authority and the psychiatric issues of eating behavior and obesity. And then we had our Penn Rotabaugh Diabetes Center, which managed our diabetics, and then we had our bariatric program. And while I had a foot here and a foot here because of my research interests, the 3 programs themselves rarely came together. And we actually tried in a new building to get them all on the same floor, with the idea being we can bounce patients back and forth. And while we were able to get these 2 on the same floor, we would actually joke that you'd walk down the hallway into a waiting room, and if you were going for surgery, you went to the left. And if you were going for diabetes care, you went to the right, and you never crossed the midpoint. And so while our system tried to get people to integrate around this issue, the clinicians really struggled to do so. And I think that can be a challenge for a lot of systems. So we really lacked and made the argument to our leadership that we lacked this organized multidisciplinary center and that we needed to capitalize on our expertise. And we were able to pitch it to them in a way that said this is another way that we can distinguish ourselves from our peer institutions in the region and around the country, let alone our competition more locally, because there was nobody else in the Philadelphia area who had figured out how to do this either. So we got green-lighted to develop something we called the Translational Center for Excellence in Metabolism. We did not call it an obesity center, because obesity doesn't market well. It doesn't. It's funny, our people in development would always talk to us about, boy, you know, you guys could launch this center right away if you could just get a grateful patient to be a donor. People love to donate to cancer centers after being cured of a brain tumor. People don't donate to bariatric surgery programs after they've had bariatric surgery. They typically don't want people to know. So we never were able to find the proverbial sugar daddy to really underwrite the center. That's a bad pun. To underwrite the center. Every time I use it, just kind of slip it. You know, the longer I go, the looser my language gets over time. So I'm glad I've only got about 2 minutes left. So we were able, encouragingly, to get buy-in from our senior leadership. So the CFO of the health system, the dean of the School of Medicine, who said this is one of our strategic plans, and they actually made a $5 million investment in launching the center. We had to create a business plan, we had to talk about return on investments and so forth. But you can see that we had to have buy-in from medicine, psychiatry, and surgery, from IDOM, which are our Diabetes Institute, our Cardiovascular Institute, and our Sleep Center. And the idea being that when patients entered the center, they potentially would touch on all of or many of these departments, depending upon the nature of their comorbidities. But the one thing we were definitely committed to was not reinventing the wheel. So if somebody from sleep medicine referred a patient to this TSEM, we didn't redo a sleep study if it had just been done. So we were also using what had been in the electronic medical record or from our external patients. So patients would come in, and do come in now, and receive a consultation led by both a physician and a behaviorist. So the first visit, they see one of our attending physicians, usually in internal or family medicine, and then they also meet with a dietitian. At the end of that visit, there's an initial discussion of what the treatment approach is going to be. And it could either be lifestyle modification, with or without pharmacotherapy, or also a referral to bariatric surgery because we thought that was ethically appropriate for people with a BMI who met the diagnostic criteria. But then we also talked about a personalized risk control platform that would be developed in consultation with the other specialists, and then really kind of trading on the expertise of my former center there, developing a personalized weight management plan with our patients. So at the initial eval, we reviewed their medical records, we did a detailed clinical interview where we drilled down on their psychosocial and behavioral history using a tool called the WALI, the Weight and Lifestyle Inventory, and then we added some additional psychometric measures and symptom inventories looking at things like depression and anxiety. And we organized our thinking using the acronym BEST, representing the biological, environmental, social, psychological, and I think very importantly, the timing factors for weight loss. I think oftentimes patients come in for weight loss from a position of desperation, but we also want to make sure that patients aren't trying to make a commitment to change their lifestyle, whether dealing with other major life stressors like unemployment, a failing marriage, and so forth. So we really want patients to do this when the window is open for success. We do a lot with combined treatment when we can with regards to insurance reimbursement, because we do believe that while lifestyle modification helps people modify the external environment, pharmacotherapy and also bariatric surgery can help modify the internal environment and lead to an additive effect in terms of long-term weight control. And then another thing that we're doing going forward is really capitalizing on the use of technology. So that would be things like smartphones and Fitbits, but also we're the home of a platform at Penn called Way to Health, led by Kevin Volpe and David Ash, who are two physicians who are also embedded in health economics at the Wharton School of Business at Penn, who have developed this online platform to monitor health behavior. And the idea being that if you take your blood sugar at home or your blood pressure at home, that equipment can send information directly into your electronic medical record that your medical team can follow on a regular basis without an in-person visit. And they make the argument that this is really all about what's called medical hovering, their phrase, not mine, where devices can be used to promote and monitor adaptive health before the really scary diseases set in. And while we have developed this comprehensive clinic, we know that we're not ready to take everything under the umbrella. So we still have a number of weight management programs that are ongoing in our HIV clinics, in places like pediatrics, infertility, and then also among some of our breast cancer survivors. So while we're going to work towards, or the clinic will work towards being comprehensive over time, we weren't ready, nor did we think it would help competitively to bring everything into a centralized location just to start. And I just want to end with these last two slides to give you something to think about. That while we have these three major treatment modalities, lifestyle modification, pharmacotherapy, and bariatric surgery, the reality is we need to be thinking about phenotypes of obesity. And just like we think about subtypes of cancer, and that depending upon the genetic data, you will be treated with this, that, or the other, we probably need to take that same thinking to obesity. And there was this very provocative slide that came out a couple years ago from Anita Kirklis and colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh that actually showed that after a gastric bypass, In the first 6 months, everybody does about the same. So everybody loses about 25% of their weight within the first 6 months. A really impressive outcome. Because remember, lifestyle modification at 6 months is going to get you to about that point at best. But look what happens after that. You have 5 distinct patterns of outcomes. And you've got 3 where people are continuing to lose weight and do well, and it's the majority of patients. But then you got this 23 to 25% who either plateau or start regaining. And while I hedge my bets that a lot of the variance here is going to be accounted for by behavior and environment, there are people who will argue quite the opposite and say, you know what, there's probably something going on genetically that's making that difference as well. And I do think as we look to the future of long-term obesity care, we need to be mindful that even though I like to trumpet the environment and behavior horn as much as possible, there probably are significant genetic and physiological components that we'll need to consider to successfully manage and prevent obesity in the future. Thank you all very much. Okay.
Going on the theory that part of this is genetic, we know the incidence of obesity was, say, back in the early 1900s compared to today?
I'm not aware of any population-based data that would go out and look at it. And so I've never seen anyone take that Enns-Haynes data that I showed you and work it backwards in that way. For those of you who couldn't hear the question, or those of you watching remotely, the question was, what was the incidence of obesity about a century ago? And I think the reality is that we don't know. But I think most people who look at obesity from an evolutionary perspective would say it probably isn't what we see today. Still not aware of anything that's particularly compelling that would show that trajectory. Most of us use that slide that I showed you, which really starts in the mid-1970s.
Another question. So I'm thinking that the gastric bypass surgeries, et cetera, anything that involves surgery is probably smiled upon because it brings in dollars to healthcare systems. I wonder how many intensive ABT or CBT programs have been tried for long-term obesity.
So for those of you who didn't hear, the question was that while health systems probably smile upon bariatric surgery because of the economics behind it, and the reality is that they do, they tend to be very profitable programs. Several years ago, our lead surgeon had a kidney stone and apparently was in the hospital, was hospitalized right before a vacation, and the story goes that senior leadership was in his hospital room begging him not to go on vacation, because that it would actually be a financial hit to the institution if he didn't operate for 2 or 3 consecutive weeks. And that's in a big, major health system like Penn's. So I think you're absolutely right that there are major economic, and that's also why I think we saw the boom of bariatric programs over the last 10 to 15 years, because they can be profitable programs for their system. In terms of the economics of CBT and DBT, so one of the challenges we have always faced at Penn is insurance reimbursement for mental health coverage for obesity. So in the early days of the Center for Weight and Eating Disorders and our clinical arm of the program, we did not accept insurance. And we didn't accept insurance for the psych evals we did before bariatric surgery. And we were collecting probably about 90 to 95% of what we billed. So we were doing some, but not a lot of pro bono and reduced fee work, and we would have our graduate students and our fellows who would work on a sliding scale. And then we shifted to an insurance model, and our collections dropped from 95% to less than 50% in a year, because what was happening, and this goes back about 10 years ago, we would submit a claim, and the insurance companies would say, well, but obesity is not a psychiatric illness, and you're billing out of a department of psychiatry, so we're not going to pay it. Or you're a psychologist, and obesity is not in the DSM, we're not going to pay it. And even though we would then say, but we are national and international experts in this, We do a very reputable behaviorally based program. We do, research on it. They would, you'd get caught up in the low levels of reviewers, and we were just hemorrhaging money. And so we had to go back to a fee-for-service model. Subsequent to that, we've had discussions with insurance companies about using our position as thought leaders to try to argue for better coverage, with some success, but not uniform success. There are a couple studies actually that have come out in the last few years using not DBT but more CBT with people with extreme obesity, and they're remarkably consistent with what you see with people with BMIs in the 30s and 40s, that you can help people lose 5 to 7% of their weight, but they typically start regaining it back. And I also, and I mentioned this in passing just a moment ago, I do think you start to get into a medical decision-making ethical issue. So if you've got a patient with a BMI of 42 who's healthy, who hasn't done a lot in terms of other weight loss efforts, I think giving them an intensive lifestyle program is defensible. I think if you've got a patient with a BMI of 65 with diabetes and hypertension, I better have a really good, and has done Weight Watchers 3 times and done Jenny Craig and Nutrisystem, I better have a really good reason to recommend lifestyle modification yet again, as opposed to bariatric surgery. And in fact, there was a private practitioner in the Philadelphia area who got sued for malpractice for doing exactly that, that she put somebody on an intensive lifestyle modification program, and the patient, who was also a mental health professional, said, "Why didn't you recommend me for bariatric surgery?" So I do think for people with more severe obesity and the comorbidities, you do need to factor that into the treatment model or the decision-making model in terms of treatments.
I'd like to rename your talk A Day in My Life.
Well, that's better than you saying that you don't agree with anything that I said.
I'm very sorry that you went over the statistics for mortality and morbidity. I was about to jump on top of that, but it's very low. It's about the same as having a cholecystitis, a high volume center.
Right.
And I think that's because of that data. I couldn't agree more with what you said. I do a lot of revisional surgery, and on our last bariatric meeting, committee meeting, I stressed the importance that maybe all this revisional surgery is not what we need. We may need to reset the set point of obesity in morbidly obese patients, and I would stress to the audience that I think the disease of overweight and obesity is different than the disease of morbid obesity.
Code team 2605, Delisado, ICU team to respond.
And one of the things that I stressed is that I think the next step of the good bariatric surgery program is to move on to behavior modification and medical therapy.
Yeah.
And I think we're completely lacking to say we are a bariatric surgery program without those two modalities.
Yeah, and it's my turn to agree with you completely. And I've sometimes made the point to a more bariatric, when I'm at a meeting where it's specifically dedicated to bariatrics, that I think that over the last 10 or 15 years, for those of us who work in bariatric teams, we've had to spend so much time fighting the fight with insurance companies for preoperative coverage that we got distracted from figuring out how to manage patients more effectively postoperatively. And so, and the end result is that we're in a climate now where, and it probably played a role in the death of the band, which is that once you got outside that 60 or 90-day window, you're not having insurance coverage, and patients weren't coming back for follow-up the way they would in places like Australia, so you weren't seeing the outcomes that you would see. And if they were going to come back and even see your dietitian or your psychologist, you weren't necessarily going to get reimbursed for that. And again, I think as programs, we got distracted, and we've been slow to look at strategies to promote the long-term success in our patients, and that really needs to be our focus going forward.
I'm sure this is going to come up later, because I'm going to bring it up if it doesn't. But one of the things that might have something to do with these two conversations is, right now we're still in this, I'm going to call it fee-for-service widget economy that we have in medicine. If we, in fact, move into an accountable care outcome-based performance risk-sharing model, that'll be risky. But the other thing that it might give the opportunity for is more innovation, because it'll be these outcomes that we're trying to achieve rather than billing security. Is that true, or is that,
No, I
16 years old?
No, but I feel like I've shared your optimism for that for the last several years, and unfortunately now that's making me nervous. That I feel like we've been on the cusp of that so long that I'm beginning to think maybe it's never going to happen.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
And that as a result, we're just going to be stuck in the place that we are now. But one point I will make to that, which surprised me, I think sometimes when we have to deal with insurance companies, we sometimes we have a great deal of apprehension, if not dread, and we don't want to get on the phone. They're not going to want to meet with us. We play a role of making it confrontational. And we had gotten wind that one of our major payers in the Philadelphia area was going to move from 3 months of preoperative medical weight management to 6 months with primary care physicians. And that what they were going to do is that patients were going to have to go see their internal medicine doc once a month for 6 months just to weigh in, document the weight, put it in the medical record. And if they did that for 6 consecutive months, then they'd approve them for surgery. And we were able to get the medical directors in and say, look, there's no evidence that says what you're recommending is going to provide good clinical care to these patients. We feel like we can do an intensive, we will have our patients work with a dietitian, we'll have them go to monthly support groups. If we reduce down to 3 months, but we add these other elements to the program, which will truly be about getting people ready for surgery and not just about checking a box, would you let us do that? And they said yes. So they were very receptive to us saying, we, in the spirit of a center of excellence or quality of care, we can do this better. And we were prepared for them to kind of negotiate back and forth, and they just said, that sounds good to us. So I think I've always used that anecdote as a way to think that maybe in some cases, if we go as organized programs or institutions and have a pleasant, respectful conversation, that sometimes we can move that needle a little bit.
One of the problems, we are in the 6-month monthly waiting. It becomes very, very difficult for patients to overcome all these hurdles.
Yeah.
Even if they had the time and the effort.
Yep.
The co-pays
Mm-hmm.
for $50 for the attorney,
Yep.
for the psychiatrist.
Yep.
We get them into the office, and we can't keep them in the office.
Yeah.
Because they just burn out.
Yep.
They say, you know what, I can't do this no matter how much I want this.
We learned that lesson the hard way with some of our post-operative interventions. We were trying to do some dietary counseling in the post-operative period, and we had to fall back from in-person visits every other week to once-a-month visit and phone calls, because what patients were telling us, which at the time, it's one of those things where you kind of hit the side of your head and said, why didn't we think of this? They had burned all their vacation and personal time doing all the pre-op requirements. And so when you want to see them for follow-up, they have no time left to burn and take off. And, we sometimes think, well, it's only a half an hour with us, but we forget that it's a half an hour getting to the facility and a half an hour of parking and getting out and getting home. And you're pretty much looking at taking off half a day. And that, this was also going on around the period of time where the economy really went down. And I think people were really reluctant to take time off from their employers lest they get let go because they're seen as a non-loyal employee. Well, I want to thank you all very much for your time and attention today. I hope this has been helpful to all of you.